The fluorescent lights in the county assistant's office hummed with the same tired frequency as Margaret Walsh's bones. At 73, she sat in a plastic chair that squeaked every time she shifted her weight, clutching a manila folder that held the remains of her dignity, past due notices, medication bills she couldn't afford, and a letter from the bank threatening foreclosure on the small trailer she and her husband Harold had called home for the past 30 years. Before we dive into this story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The folder was worn at the edges, soft from being opened and closed too many times. Inside, the papers told a story Margaret wished she could rewrite. Electric bill, $97 overdue. Water, $43. Harold's heart medication, $218 for a 30-day supply. And beneath it all, the foreclosure notice printed on cream-colored paper that felt too expensive for something so cruel. Final notice: payment required within 6 weeks or property will be seized. Harold sat beside her, his weathered hands folded in his lap, the knuckles swollen from 50 years of construction work that had eventually broken his body. He was 76 now, and every morning he woke up feeling older than the day before. His hearing aids whistled softly, a sound Margaret had long since stopped noticing. They'd been married for 54 years, and in all that time, they'd never asked for help. Not once. But pride doesn't pay the electric bill. Pride doesn't keep the heat on when winter rolls through Ohio with teeth made of ice. Margaret glanced at Harold from the corner of her eye. He was staring at a poster on the wall about diabetes prevention, but she knew he wasn't reading it. He was somewhere else, probably back in the days when his hands were strong and steady, when he could swing a hammer for 12 hours straight and still have energy to dance with her in the kitchen while dinner simmered on the stove. Those days felt like they belonged to different people now. The caseworker, a young woman named Ashley who couldn't have been older than 25, typed something into her computer with perfectly manicured nails. Each click of the keyboard felt like a judgment. Margaret looked down at her own hands, calloused and spotted with age, the skin thin as tissue paper. Her wedding ring, once snug, now spun loosely around her finger. She'd lost weight this year. They both had. Not on purpose. "Mrs. Walsh," Ashley said gently, her voice carrying that particular tone of professional sympathy that Margaret had come to recognize and hate. It was the voice people used when they felt sorry for you but couldn't actually help. "I see here that your husband's disability payments were reduced last month due to the new assessment guidelines. I'm so sorry. That's got to be incredibly difficult." Difficult. The word felt too small for what they were facing. Difficult was when the car broke down. Difficult was when the roof leaked. This was something else entirely. This was choosing between Harold's heart pills and keeping the water running. This was eating one meal a day so they could stretch the groceries. This was lying awake at 3 in the morning doing math in her head, trying to figure out which bill could be delayed one more month without catastrophic consequences. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. Harold reached over and placed his hand on hers. His grip was weak now, the strength that had once lifted steel beams and built houses reduced to a trembling squeeze. But it was still the safest thing she'd ever known. "We've applied for additional food assistance," Ashley continued, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "And I'm going to flag your case for emergency heating support before winter hits. Ohio winters can be brutal, and at your age, you need to stay warm. But I have to be honest with you, there's a waiting list. It could be months before anything comes through." Months. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. They didn't have months. The foreclosure notice gave them 6 weeks. 6 weeks to come up with $8,000 in back payments or lose the only home they had. The trailer wasn't much 1,200 square feet of aluminum siding, avocado green carpet from 1978, a bathroom where the sink dripped no matter how many times Harold tried to fix it. But it was theirs. Or it had been, until the medical bills started piling up faster than they could pay them. Ashley printed out a stack of papers and slid them across the desk. These are applications for additional programs. There's a prescription assistance program through the state, and a non-profit that helps with utility bills. Fill these out and bring them back next week. I'll do everything I can to expedite the process. Margaret took the papers with hands that shook slightly. She wanted to thank Ashley. The girl meant well. But all Margaret could think about was the fact that she'd worked her entire life, 41 years, as a seamstress in a factory that closed in 2008. And now she was filling out forms to beg for help, paying her electric bill. They left the office in silence. Harold's walker clicking against the cracked pavement as they made their way to their ancient Buick, a 1998 LeSabre, with 193,000 miles on it. The car was older than some of their grandchildren. The paint had faded from deep blue to a watery gray blue, and the back bumper was held on with wire and duct tape. But it ran, mostly. It burned oil and coughed blue smoke when you started it. But it ran. Margaret helped Harold into the passenger seat, her back screaming in protest as she lifted his walker and folded it. It was heavier than it looked, or maybe she was just weaker than she used to be. She placed it carefully in the trunk, next to a cardboard box filled with aluminum cans they'd been collecting from the park and the side of the road. 2 weeks of collecting had yielded maybe $3 worth. Every penny counted now. "We'll figure it out," Harold said as she climbed behind the wheel. His voice was rough as sandpaper, damaged from years of smoking before he finally quit at age 62. But it was gentle, the way it had always been with her. "We always do. Maggie. Maggie." He was the only person who'd ever called her that. Margaret started the car and said nothing. She didn't have the heart to tell him she didn't know how this time. She'd been saying, "We'll figure it out," for 3 years now, ever since Harold's heart attack forced him into early retirement, and the medical bills started arriving like a flood that never receded. She'd been juggling, robbing Peter to pay Paul, stretching every dollar until it screamed. But you can only stretch something so far before it breaks. They drove home in silence, past the Dollar General and the closed-down factory where Margaret had once worked, past the elementary school where their daughter had gone before she moved to Oregon and stopped calling quite as often. The town looked tired, worn down by the same economic forces that had worn down Margaret and Harold. Half the storefronts on Main Street were empty, their windows papered over or broken. The hardware store where Harold used to buy supplies had a big "Going out of business" sign in the window. Their trailer park was at the edge of town, a collection of mobile homes in various states of decay. Some folks kept their places nice, neat lawns, flower boxes, little garden gnomes. Others had given up. Margaret and Harold's place was somewhere in the middle. The steps needed fixing. The skirting was loose in places. But Margaret kept flowers in pots by the door, and Harold had built a small wooden ramp 2 years ago when the walker became necessary. Inside, the trailer smelled like the cinnamon air freshener Margaret bought from the Dollar Tree, and the faint, permanent odor of cooking oil that had seeped into the walls over 3 decades. The living room was small but tidy. Their furniture was old, a floral couch they'd bought used in 1987. A coffee table Harold had built himself. A television that still had a VCR built in. Pictures covered every available surface. Their wedding photo from 1971. Harold in his army uniform from Vietnam. Their 3 kids at various ages. Their 7 grandchildren. Margaret helped Harold settle into his recliner. The one piece of furniture they'd splurged on 5 years ago when his back got bad. She brought him a glass of water and his afternoon pills, 6 of them. A rainbow of colors that cost more per month than their car insurance. "I'm going to make dinner," she said. Harold nodded, already reaching for the TV remote. He liked watching the old westerns on the classic movie channel. Margaret knew he watched them not because he particularly loved cowboys, but because they reminded him of watching TV with his father when he was a boy. When things were simpler, when the future still felt full of possibility. In the kitchen, Margaret opened the refrigerator and assessed their supplies. Half a carton of eggs, some cheese that was getting close to the expiration date, a package of hot dogs, 3 slices of bread, a head of lettuce that was starting to wilt. She'd need to go to the food bank tomorrow. The thought made her stomach hurt, but there was no shame left to lose. She'd been going every week for 6 months now. She scrambled 2 eggs and split them between 2 plates, adding a piece of toast to each. It wasn't much, but it would do. They'd learned to eat less, to be satisfied with what they had. Margaret had read somewhere that fasting was good for you anyway. She tried to believe it. They ate dinner in front of the TV, balanced plates on their laps, Harold watching his western and Margaret pretending to watch while her mind ran through numbers again. 8,000 to stop the foreclosure, 97 for electric, 43 for water, 218 for Harold's pills, due in 10 days, and somewhere underneath all of that, the crushing weight of knowing that even if they somehow survived this month, next month would bring the same impossible math. After dinner, Margaret washed the dishes by hand. They hadn't had a working dishwasher in 7 years, and tried not to think about anything at all. She dried each plate carefully and put it away. Routine. Normalcy. The illusion that everything was fine. Harold had fallen asleep in his chair, his mouth slightly open, hands folded over his stomach. Margaret covered him with the afghan she'd crocheted back when her hands were steadier. She kissed his forehead, tasting salt and age and love, and whispered, "Sweet dreams, baby." Then she stepped outside. The evening air was cool, autumn creeping in with that particular Ohio chill that promised winter wasn't far behind. Margaret sat on the concrete steps and lit a cigarette, one of 3 she allowed herself per day. She'd promised Harold she'd quit, and she mostly had. But sometimes she needed the burn in her lungs, the brief, dizzy relief of nicotine cutting through the constant anxiety. The trailer park was quiet. Somewhere a dog barked. A few trailers down, she could hear a TV through an open window. Above her, the stars were starting to appear, faint and far away. She thought about Harold inside, sleeping in his chair because lying flat made his heart work too hard. She thought about their daughter in Oregon, who'd offered to send money but couldn't really afford it. She thought about the caseworker's kind face and useless sympathy. And she thought about giving up, not in the permanent way she'd never do that to Harold, but giving up in the sense of accepting that this was it. That they'd worked their whole lives, raised 3 kids, paid their taxes, done everything right. And this was what they got at the end. A 12 by 60 trailer they were about to lose, and a stack of bills they'd never be able to pay. Margaret stubbed out the cigarette and went back inside. She checked on Harold, still sleeping, and then went to the small bedroom they shared. The bed took up most of the space, leaving just enough room for 2 dressers and a narrow path to walk. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened the drawer of her nightstand. Inside was her mother's jewelry box, a wooden thing with a ballerina that used to spin when you opened it. The mechanism was broken now. Margaret opened it and looked at the meager contents. Her mother's wedding ring, a string of fake pearls, a brooch shaped like a butterfly that her grandmother had worn to church every Sunday. Nothing worth selling. Nothing that would save them. She was about to close it when she noticed something tucked underneath the jewelry tray. A folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. She didn't remember putting it there. Margaret pulled it out carefully and unfolded it. It was a family tree, hand-drawn by her mother years ago. Margaret traced the names with her finger. Her mother, Ruth, Ruth's parents, Ruth's siblings. And there, on a branch she'd forgotten about, a name, Edmund Thorne, listed as Ruth's first cousin. Margaret frowned. Edmund. She had a vague memory of him, tall, quiet, wore expensive suits. He'd come to her mother's funeral back in 1989, shook her hand, said something polite about how Ruth had been a good woman, then he'd left, and she'd never heard from him again. She put the paper back in the jewelry box and closed it. A meaningless memory, a distant relative she'd never known. 3 days later, an envelope arrived. Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to figure out which bill to pay first with the $63 they had left until Harold's next disability check, when she heard the mail slot clang. She retrieved the mail with a sense of dread. Mail these days was always bad news. Bills, advertisements, and a thick manila envelope with a return address from a law firm in Los Angeles, Whitmore, Chen, and Associates. Margaret stared at it. Los Angeles. She didn't know anyone in Los Angeles. Her first thought was scam. She'd heard about those fake lawyers, fake inheritances, elaborate schemes to steal money from vulnerable people. Harold had already hung up on 3 IRS agents that month alone. But the envelope felt expensive. The paper was thick, high quality, and there was something about official legal letterhead that made it feel real. She opened it carefully, her heart beating faster than it should. Inside was a letter, professionally printed, with a gold embossed seal at the top. Dear Mrs. Margaret Walsh, we are writing to inform you that you have been named as the sole surviving beneficiary in the estate of Mr. Edmund Thorne, who passed away on September 14th of this year. Mr. Thorne was your mother's first cousin, and according to his will, you are entitled to inherit his primary property located at 17,000 Mockingbird Canyon Road, Malibu, California. Margaret's hands began to shake. She had to set the letter down on the table and take 3 deep breaths before she could continue reading. The property consists of a 12,000 square foot residential estate on 43 acres. Please note that the property has been vacant for approximately 18 years and carries outstanding tax liens totaling $76,000. As the inheritor, you have 60 days to either claim the property and settle the liens, or the estate will be transferred to the state of California. Additional documentation is enclosed. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss next steps. We understand this may come as a surprise, and we are here to assist you through this process. Sincerely, Jennifer Castellano, Esquire, Whitmore, Chen, and Associates. Margaret read it 3 times. Then she stood up, walked to the living room where Harold was reading the newspaper, and read it to him. Her voice shook the entire time. When she finished, Harold looked at her over the top of his reading glasses. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Edmund Thorne," Margaret finally whispered. "I barely remember him. He came to Mama's funeral back in '89, wore a fancy suit. Didn't say much." Harold took the letter from her hands and read it himself, his lips moving slightly as he processed the words. "Malibu. That's movie star country. Maggie. It's probably a shack," Margaret said quickly, trying not to let herself believe. "Has to be. Otherwise, why would it have tax liens? Why would it be sitting empty for 18 years? But even as she said it, her heart was beating faster than it had in years. 12,000 square feet. 43 acres. In Malibu. This could be our way out," Harold said quietly. Margaret sat down hard in the chair next to him. "We don't have $76,000, Harold." "No. But maybe we could sign the deed over to someone who does. Get something for it. Even if it's just a little bit, it might be enough to save the trailer." They sat in silence, the letter between them, like a bridge to a future they'd stopped believing in. That evening, after Margaret had called the number on the letterhead 5 times and hung up before anyone answered, she finally let it ring through. A professional voice answered. "Whitmore, Chen and Associates. How may I direct your call?" Margaret's mouth was dry. I received a letter about an inheritance. From Edmund Thorne? One moment, please. I'll transfer you to Miss Castellano's office. Hold music." Margaret's leg bounced nervously. Harold watched her from the couch, his expression hopeful and terrified in equal measure. "This is Jennifer Castellano." The voice was young, efficient, kind. Margaret explained who she was, fumbling over her words. Jennifer listened patiently, then spent the next 20 minutes explaining the situation in more detail. Edmund Thorne had been a reclusive art dealer who'd made his fortune in the 1970s and 80s. He'd never married, had no children, and had lived alone in the Malibu estate until 2006, when health problems forced him into assisted living. He died 3 weeks ago in a nursing home, and Margaret was the only living relative anyone could locate. "The property is in rough shape," Jennifer warned. "It's been sitting empty for nearly 2 decades. Vandals broke in a few times. The roof probably leaks. Copper pipes were stolen. But the land alone is worth something significant. Malibu oceanfront property, even in disrepair, has value." "How much value?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Conservatively, the land is probably worth somewhere between $5 and $8 million. But that's only if you can clear the tax liens first. 5 million, 8 million. The numbers were so large they didn't feel real. Margaret tried to do the math, to understand what even half of that would mean. It meant never worrying about bills again. It meant Harold could get the heart surgery his doctor had recommended but they couldn't afford. It meant living, not just surviving. "Mrs. Walsh, are you still there? Mrs. Walsh, Mrs. Walsh, Mrs. Walsh, Mrs. Walsh. Yes, sorry. This is a lot to process." "I understand. Listen, here's the situation. You have 60 days to claim the property and settle the liens. If you can't cover the $76,000, there are options. Investors who specialize in this kind of thing. They'd pay the liens in exchange for a stake in the sale." "What kind of stake?" "Typically 50%. It's not ideal, but if you don't have the capital, 50%. That would still leave them with millions, more money than they'd ever imagined. But it also meant giving up half of something that was legally theirs." "Can I think about it?" Margaret asked. Of course. But time is a factor. The 60-day clock is already ticking. That night, Margaret and Harold sat at their kitchen table surrounded by papers. The letter from the law firm, printed Google Maps images of Malibu, a calculator, Harold's disability statement, the foreclosure notice. They did math until Margaret's head hurt. If they cashed in Harold's small life insurance policy, $5,000, and scraped together every penny they had, they could afford gas money and maybe a cheap motel for the drive to California. They couldn't afford plane tickets. They couldn't afford much of anything. But if they could just get there, see the property, sign whatever papers needed signing. It's insane, Margaret said for the 10th time. It's hope, Harold replied. And really, what else did they have? They left on a Tuesday morning, everything they owned locked in the trailer. A note left for their neighbor Gloria asking her to collect their mail. The Buick wheezed as Margaret backed out of their gravel driveway, blue smoke puffing from the exhaust. Harold had packed sandwiches, peanut butter, and jelly, the cheap kind from the dollar store, and filled 2 thermoses with coffee. The drive was long. Ohio to California, 2,000 miles, 4 days if they pushed it. They couldn't afford hotels, so they slept in the car at rest stops. Harold reclined in the passenger seat. Margaret curled in the back, both of them aching and exhausted but driven by something bigger than comfort. They crossed Indiana, Illinois, Missouri. The landscape changed from green to tan, to red desert. They stopped only for gas and bathrooms, eating their sandwiches while they drove, sipping water from plastic bottles they refilled at rest stops. Harold's back seized up somewhere in Kansas. Margaret pulled over and helped him walk it off, tears streaming down her face as she watched him shuffle along the shoulder of the interstate, bent and hurting. This trip could kill him. His heart was weak. The stress, the discomfort. But what choice did they have? They pushed on. By day 4, they were in California. The landscape shifted again, mountains rising, the air turning cooler and smelling like something Margaret couldn't quite name. Salt, maybe, ocean. When they finally pulled onto Mockingbird Canyon Road, the sun was just beginning to set. The road wound upward, narrow and cracked, lined with overgrown vegetation. Margaret's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel. And then, around a final bend, there it was, the mansion. Margaret's foot hit the brake without her meaning to. The car stopped, engine idling rough. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," Harold whispered. It was enormous, bigger than any house Margaret had ever seen outside of movies. Stone and stucco, 3 stories at least, with turrets and balconies, and massive arched windows. It sat perched on a hillside, surrounded by cypress trees and wild rosemary, overlooking a sliver of ocean visible through the fog. The exterior was weathered, yes. The windows were dark. Vines climbed the walls. The driveway was cracked and full of weeds. The massive iron gate hung crooked on its hinges. One side, dragging in the dirt, but even in decay, it was breathtaking. Margaret pulled forward slowly, the Buick's tires crunching over gravel and debris. She parked in what had once been a circular driveway, the fountain in the center dry and crumbling, filled with dead leaves. They sat in the car, not speaking, not moving, just staring. Finally, Harold opened his door. The sound of the ocean was louder now, a constant whisper beneath the wind. Margaret got out and stood in the driveway, looking up at the house. It felt impossible, like a dream, like a mistake. "We own this," she said out loud. To no one. To the house itself. Harold had his walker out now, moving slowly toward the front entrance. The door was massive, solid wood, 12 feet tall at least, with wrought iron details and a knocker shaped like a lion's head. Margaret retrieved the key from her purse. The lawyer had overnighted it, along with the deed and instructions. The key was old, brass, heavy in her palm, ornate, like something from a castle. She climbed the stone steps, 6 of them, chipped and uneven, and stood before the door. Her hand was shaking as she fitted the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, like it had been waiting. The door swung open. Inside, the air was cool and still, thick with dust and the smell of old wood and stone. The foyer was grand, high ceilings disappearing into shadow. A chandelier hung overhead, dark and cobwebbed. To the left was a sweeping staircase with a carved wooden banister. To the right, a hallway stretched into darkness. Margaret took one step inside. Her footsteps echoed. "This place is bigger than our whole trailer park," Harold murmured, his voice full of awe. They moved slowly through the house, room by room. The furniture was still there, draped in white sheets like ghosts. The kitchen was gutted, appliances gone. Copper pipes ripped out, but the structure was beautiful. Arched doorways, a fireplace large enough to stand in, hand-painted tiles on the walls. Upstairs, there were bedrooms, 6 of them, each one larger than their entire trailer. Bathrooms with clawfoot tubs and marble sinks. Windows that looked out over the ocean. But it was when they reached the library that everything changed. The room was lined floor to ceiling with built-in bookshelves, all of them empty now. The wood dark and rich, but on the far wall, something caught Margaret's eye. A section of shelving that didn't quite match. The wood was slightly different. The spacing off. She walked over slowly and ran her hand along the edge. It felt loose. "Harold," she called softly. He appeared in the doorway, breathing hard. "What is it?" "I think this moves." Together, they pushed against the shelving. At first, nothing. Then a groan, a give. The entire section swung inward like a door, revealing a narrow hallway beyond. Margaret's heart hammered. "Did you know this was here?" Harold shook his head, eyes wide. Margaret grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. The hallway was dark, narrow, descending, stone walls. At the end, maybe 20 feet down, was another door. This one was steel, modern, out of place in this old house, and it had a keypad. Margaret stared at it, her pulse racing in her ears. What in the world? Harold leaned against the stone wall, too winded to speak, but his eyes said everything. "Be careful." Margaret looked around. Above the keypad, barely visible in the dust, were 4 numbers carved into the stone. Crude, done by hand. 1963. 1963. The year Edmund was born. Maybe. Margaret didn't know. But it was the only clue she had. She hesitated, then punched the numbers in. A soft beep, then a click. Mechanical and final. The steel door swung inward. Cool air rushed out, and with it, the smell of something preserved, something protected. Margaret stepped forward, Harold close behind, and crossed the threshold into whatever lay beyond. The lights flickered on automatically. Soft LEDs, illuminating a space that stole the breath from Margaret's lungs. A vault, and inside, more treasure than she'd ever imagined existed in the real world. The room beyond the steel door was unlike anything Margaret had ever seen. It wasn't just a basement. It wasn't just storage. It was a sanctuary, a fortress, a cathedral built to protect something precious. The space was massive, stretching at least 40 feet in each direction, with ceilings that rose 12 feet high. The walls were lined with sleek wooden panels, dark walnut or mahogany, expertly fitted. The floor was polished concrete, sealed and perfect, and the air was cool and dry, climate controlled, humming with the soft sound of machinery that had been running, waiting, for nearly 2 decades. But it was what filled the room that made Margaret's knees weak. Artwork. Everywhere. Dozens of pieces, maybe more. Paintings in ornate gilded frames leaned against the walls, stacked carefully on custom shelving. Sculptures sat on pedestals, their forms caught in marble and bronze. Glass cases held what looked like jewelry, rare books, vintage watches, artifacts Margaret couldn't even name. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Harold, are you seeing this?" Harold had stopped just inside the doorway, gripping his walker, his face pale and slack. His eyes darted from one piece to the next, trying to comprehend what they were looking at. "I'm seeing it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't believe it, but I'm seeing it." Margaret moved deeper into the vault, her footsteps silent on the smooth floor. Her eyes couldn't settle on any one thing. A painting of a woman in blue, the brushstrokes soft and dreamlike. A sculpture of a dancer, frozen mid-leap, her bronze skin catching the LED light. A glass case filled with leather-bound books, their spines embossed with gold lettering in languages Margaret didn't recognize. She stopped in front of a large painting, maybe 4 feet across, hung on a custom mount. It was a landscape, rolling hills, soft light, impressionistic in a way that made her think of Sunday afternoons at the art museum, when her children were small. She leaned closer, squinting at the signature in the corner. Her breath caught. "Monet. That can't be real," she whispered to herself. But it looked real. The canvas had texture, depth. The colors seemed to shimmer with inner light. And beside it, mounted on the wall, was a small brass placard. Claude Monet, Morning at Giverny, 1888. Acquired 1979. Authenticated by Sotheby's. Margaret's head spun. She turned to another painting. This one was darker, more abstract geometric shapes in deep reds and blacks. The signature was bolder, slashed across the corner. Rothko. Another placard. Mark Rothko, untitled, red and black. 1968. Acquired 1981. Her legs felt weak. She reached out and steadied herself against a nearby shelf. "Harold, these are real. They're really real." Harold had made his way to a glass case in the center of the room. Inside was a collection of jewelry, not costume pieces, but the kind of jewelry Margaret had only ever seen in magazines. Diamond necklaces that caught the light like frozen fire, emerald bracelets, a ring with a ruby the size of a grape, and beside the case, a leather binder. Margaret joined him, her hands trembling as she picked up the binder. The leather was soft, expensive, embossed with gold initials, E.T. Edmund Thorne. She opened it carefully, the pages stiff with age but perfectly preserved. Inside was a catalogue, handwritten in neat, precise script. Each entry listed a piece of art or jewelry, its origin, purchase, date, and value. Margaret's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. The numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. Some entries simply read, "Priceless. Not for sale." She stopped on one page, her finger tracing the words as she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. Acquired 1987. Private sale. Hollywood Hills Estate. Blue period study. Verified Picasso. Estimated value at time of purchase, $4.2 million. Harold sank into a nearby chair, the only piece of furniture in the room, a leather reading chair positioned near one of the cases. "Margaret, this isn't possible. People don't just have this kind of stuff sitting in basements." But they did. Edmund Thorne did. And somehow, impossibly, it now belonged to them. Margaret kept flipping through the ledger. More paintings, rare sculptures, first edition books signed by authors she'd only heard of in passing. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Steinbeck, Faulkner. A collection of vintage movie posters, each one protected in archival sleeves and marked with values that made her dizzy. Original theatrical posters from Casablanca, Gone with the Wind, The Maltese Falcon, each worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then, near the back of the ledger, an entry that made her heart stop completely. She read it once, twice, 3 times, before the words would make sense. Hollywood Collection. Acquired 2003 through 2006. Private purchase from W.B. Pitt Estate Auction, Beverly Hills. Contents include original film memorabilia, personal artifacts, commissioned artwork, and custom vehicles. Total acquisition cost, $18 million. Estimated current value, classified, pending reassessment. Margaret looked up at Harold. W.B. Pitt. Harold blinked. Who? William Bradley Pitt. That's Brad Pitt's full name. Harold's mouth fell open slightly. The actor? The one from that movie about the baseball? Moneyball. Yes. Margaret's mind was racing now, connecting pieces. Edmund bought part of an estate sale from Brad Pitt. That's why this place has been sitting here untouched. This isn't just art. This is celebrity memorabilia. Private collection stuff that was never supposed to go public. She stood abruptly and walked to the far corner of the vault, where several large objects were draped in protective coverings. The fabric was heavy, custom-made, designed to protect what lay beneath. With shaking hands, Margaret grabbed the edge of the first cover and pulled. It fell away like a curtain dropping. Underneath was a motorcycle. Not just any motorcycle, but a custom chopper, gleaming despite the years in storage. Black and chrome, low-slung, with intricate detailing along the fuel tank flames that seemed to dance in the light. Hand-painted with such precision, they looked alive. The leather seat was tooled with patterns, the handlebars wrapped in rich brown leather. A small brass placard sat on a stand beside it. Custom built for The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, 2008. Bike was designed for climactic scene, but sequence was cut, never filmed. Gifted to W.B. Pitt by production designer. Margaret's hands covered her mouth. She'd seen that movie. Harold had taken her to the theater for their anniversary that year, one of the last times they'd been able to afford such things. She remembered the story, the beautiful cinematography, Brad Pitt aging backward through time. She moved to the next covered object, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. This one was smaller, mounted on a mannequin. She pulled the cover away, a leather jacket, Brown, worn in all the right places, with brass zippers and buckles. It looked like something from the 40s or 50s, vintage but impeccably maintained. And pinned to the chest was a handwritten note on yellowed paper, protected in a clear sleeve. Troy Premiere, Los Angeles, 2004. Worn once. B. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, though she couldn't have explained why. There was something intimate about this, something personal. These weren't just props. They were pieces of a life, moments captured and preserved. She uncovered 3 more items in quick succession, barely pausing between each. A guitar, acoustic, the wood rich and golden. The signature across the body was unmistakable, even to someone who didn't follow music closely. To Brad, thanks for the inspiration. Johnny Cash. Margaret knew that name. Everyone knew that name. A placard confirmed it. Martin D. 28 acoustic guitar, signed by Johnny Cash, 2001. Gift to B. Pitt during filming of The Mexican. A collection of watches in a climate-controlled glass case. Rolexes, Omegas, Patek Philippe's, names Margaret recognized from magazine advertisements. Each one sat on a velvet cushion with its own documentation card. The values ranged from $50,000 to $300,000 for a watch. Margaret thought about the $15 Timex Harold wore, the one they'd bought at Walmart 3 years ago. And finally, a painting. This one was different from the classical pieces near the entrance. It was modern, surreal, bold colors that seemed to vibrate with energy. A figure falling through space, or maybe flying, it was hard to tell. The style was unmistakable to anyone who'd seen movie posters in the last 20 years. A placard confirmed Margaret's suspicion. Original concept art. Fight Club, 1,999. Commissioned for poster campaign, never used. Artist, Alex McLeod. Gifted to B. Pitt by director David Fincher. Harold had managed to stand and join her, moving slowly with his walker. Together, they stared at the collection surrounding them. The magnitude of it was crushing, beautiful, and overwhelming, and impossible. "How much do you think all this is worth?" Harold finally asked, his voice hoarse. Margaret shook her head slowly. She looked down at the ledger still clutched in her hands. The Brad Pitt acquisition alone had cost $18 million 20 years ago, and there were dozens of other pieces in here that had nothing to do with Brad Pitt. The Monet, the Rothko, the Picasso sketches, the jewelry, the rare books. She couldn't even begin to calculate it. Her legs gave out suddenly, and she sank to the floor, her back against the cool stone wall. The ledger slipped from her hands. Harold lowered himself beside her with great effort, his breath wheezing. And they sat together in the soft LED glow, surrounded by more wealth than most people saw in a lifetime. "What do we do?" Margaret whispered. The question felt too big for her voice. Harold reached over and took her hand. His palm was clammy, trembling. "I don't know, Maggie. I really don't know." They sat in silence for a long time. Margaret thought about their trailer back in Ohio, about the foreclosure notice sitting on their kitchen table, about the nights she'd cried herself to sleep worrying about how they'd afford Harold's medication, about the caseworker's kind but powerless face, about the waiting lists and the red tape and the endless indignity of growing old and poor in a country that had forgotten them. And now this, a fortune, hidden away, protected, waiting. "We have to tell someone," Harold finally said. "This stuff probably belongs in a museum, or back with Brad Pitt's family. We can't just keep it." Margaret looked at him. This man she'd loved for more than half a century. This man whose goodness had never wavered, even when life had beaten him down. His face was weathered, lined with years of hard work and harder times, but his eyes were clear, honest, true, and she loved him even more in that moment. "You're right," she said softly. "But first, we need to make sure we're protected. If this is as valuable as I think it is, people are going to come after it, and after us." Harold nodded slowly. "We need a lawyer, a good one, and we need to document everything. Photos, videos, copies of that ledger, before anyone knows what's down here." They spent the next 3 hours doing exactly that. Margaret used her phone to photograph every single item in the vault, every page of the ledger, every placard and certificate of authenticity. Her phone's storage filled up, so she deleted old photos, pictures of grandkids that made her heart ache to erase. But this was more important and kept shooting. Harold, despite his exhaustion and pain, made notes on a legal pad they'd found upstairs in what looked like it had once been an office. He listed each piece as best they could. Painting, landscape, signed Monet, motorcycle, custom, from Brad Pitt collection, guitar, signed Johnny Cash. His handwriting was shaky, the letters uneven but readable. When they were finally done, the sun had set completely. The mansion was dark, except for the LED lights in the vault. Margaret's phone battery was at 8%. Harold looked like he might collapse at any moment, his face gray with exhaustion. "We need to get out of here," Margaret said. "Find a motel, get some rest, figure out our next move." Harold nodded weakly. They locked the vault, the steel door closing with a solid thunk. Margaret punched the code in reverse to secure it. She had no idea if that was how it worked, but it felt right. Then they pushed the wooden shelving back into place, concealing the entrance once more. The library looked innocent again. Just an empty room with built-in shelves. They walked through the dark mansion, Margaret using her phone's flashlight to guide them. Every shadow seemed threatening now. Every creak of old wood made her jump. They were sitting on a fortune, and suddenly the house felt less like a gift and more like a target. Outside, the cool California night wrapped around them. The ocean whispered in the distance, rhythmic and eternal. Margaret helped Harold back into the Buick, folding his walker and placing it in the trunk with trembling hands. She slid behind the wheel and just sat there for a moment, staring at the dark mansion through the windshield. The building looked different now, not abandoned, not forgotten, but purposeful. Like it had been waiting all these years for someone to find what Edmund had hidden. "Do you think he knew?" Harold asked quietly. "Edmund, do you think he knew we'd need it?" Margaret started the car. The engine coughed to life, loud and rough in the quiet night. "I don't know, but I'm grateful. Terrified, but grateful." They drove down the winding canyon road in silence, both of them lost in thought. Margaret's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, her mind spinning with questions. Why had Edmund hidden everything? Why hadn't he sold it, lived off the fortune, enjoyed his final years in comfort? Why had he let the house sit empty for 18 years while he lived in assisted living? Maybe he'd been protecting it, waiting for the right time, the right person. Or maybe, like them, he'd been too scared to trust anyone. They found a small motel near the ocean. Nothing fancy, just a roadside place with peeling paint and a neon sign that said, "Vacancy," in flickering pink letters. The room cost $48 for the night, which was more than Margaret wanted to spend but less than the nicer hotels she'd seen. The room was small and smelled like cigarettes and industrial cleaner. But the sheets looked clean and the heater worked. Harold collapsed onto the bed, fully clothed, too exhausted to even take off his shoes. Margaret covered him with the thin comforter and sat in the single chair by the window, staring out at the parking lot. Her phone buzzed. Low battery warning. She plugged it in to charge and opened the photo gallery. Hundreds of images. Paintings, sculptures, jewelry, the motorcycle, the guitar. She should have felt relieved. Excited. This was the answer to every prayer she'd whispered in the dark over the past 3 years. Instead, she felt terrified. Because money like this didn't come without complications. People had killed for less. And Margaret was just an old seamstress from Ohio, with arthritis, and a husband whose heart could give out at any moment. They didn't know how to navigate this world. They didn't have lawyers, or security, or any of the things that protected wealthy people from being taken advantage of. They were vulnerable. And now, they were sitting on $250 million. Margaret pulled out the business card Jennifer Castellano had included with the inheritance paperwork. The lawyer who'd sent the original letter. She'd seemed kind on the phone, professional. But could Margaret trust her? Could they trust anyone? She decided to wait until morning. Think clearly. Make a plan. What happens next will turn this inheritance upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the greatest fortunes come with the greatest responsibility. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Morning came too early. Margaret woke to find Harold still sleeping, his breathing raspy but steady. She slipped out of the room quietly and walked to a small coffee shop she'd seen across the street. The air was cool and smelled like salt water and fresh bread. She bought 2 coffees and 2 muffins blueberry, not too expensive, and carried them back. Harold was awake when she returned, sitting on the edge of the bed, looking disoriented. "Where are we?" he asked. "California. The mansion. Remember?" Understanding dawned slowly across his face, followed by something like wonder. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a dream. No, baby. It wasn't a dream. They ate breakfast in silence, both of them processing. Then, Margaret pulled out her phone and stared at Jennifer Castellano's number. "I'm going to call her," she said. Harold nodded. "Okay." The phone rang 3 times before a professional voice answered. "Whitmore, Chen, and Associates." "Yes, I need to speak with Jennifer Castellano, please." "This is Margaret Walsh." "One moment. Hold music." Margaret's leg bounced nervously. Harold watched her from the bed, his expression worried. "Mrs. Walsh, I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon. Did you make it to the property?" "Yes. We drove here. We've been inside." "Then. We've been inside. Then. And what did you think?" "I know it's probably overwhelming. The house is in rough shape, but the land value alone." "Miss Castellano," Margaret interrupted. "There's something you need to know. Something that wasn't in your paperwork." A pause. "What do you mean?" Margaret took a deep breath. "We found a hidden room, a vault, sealed behind a false wall in the library. There's a collection inside. Art, jewelry, memorabilia. A lot of it came from Brad Pitt's estate." The silence on the other end stretched so long Margaret thought the call had dropped. Miss Castellano? I'm here. I'm just processing. You're serious. Completely serious. I have photographs, documentation, a full catalogue that Edmund Thorne kept. Miss Castellano, we're not talking about a few nice paintings. We're talking about millions of dollars worth of authenticated artwork and collectibles. Another long pause. Then, carefully, Mrs. Walsh, I need you to not speak to anyone else about this. Not neighbors, not other family members, nobody. Do you understand? Margaret's stomach clenched. Why? Because if even a fraction of what you're describing is authentic, you're sitting on one of the largest privately held art collections in California. Maybe the country. And the moment word gets out, you're going to have a circus on your hands. Reporters, treasure hunters, people claiming Edmund stole pieces, people claiming you have no right to them. It will be a nightmare. What do we do? First, I need to see these photographs. Can you email them to me? I can try. I'm not very good with email on my phone. That's fine. I'll walk you through it. And then I need to get an authentication team out there immediately. Art appraisers, provenance experts, someone from a major auction house. But we do this quietly, privately. No one can know until we have everything documented and secured. Over the next hour, with Jennifer's patient guidance, Margaret figured out how to email the photographs from her phone. When Jennifer called back, her voice had changed. Sharper, more urgent. Mrs. Walsh, I'm looking at these photos right now. If these pieces are authentic, and I'm having our art specialist look at them as we speak, you're not talking about millions. You're talking about hundreds of millions. The room tilted. Margaret sat down hard on the bed. Harold grabbed her hand. The Monet alone could be worth 15 to 20 million. Jennifer continued. The Rothko, maybe 30 million. And this Brad Pitt collection. Mrs. Walsh, do you understand the cultural significance of what you're describing? These are pieces that museums would fight over. So, what do we do? Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to make some calls. Very discreet calls. I know people who specialize in this, appraisers who work with major collectors. People who can come in quietly and assess everything properly. But it's going to take a few days to arrange. In the meantime, I need you and your husband to stay near the property. Can you do that? We're at a motel about 10 minutes away. Perfect. Don't go back into the vault unless absolutely necessary. Don't tell anyone what you found. And Mrs. Walsh, consider hiring private security, even if it's just someone to watch the house. Because once this gets out, and it will get out eventually, that property is going to become a target. Margaret's hands were shaking as she ended the call. She looked at Harold. She says it could be worth hundreds of millions. Harold's face went pale. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. She's sending experts. But Harold, she said we need security, that people might try to. Margaret couldn't finish the sentence. Harold reached for her hand. We're in over our heads, Maggie. I know. But we're together. And we'll figure it out. Just like we always have. Margaret wanted to believe him. But this wasn't like the other times they'd scraped by. This wasn't about juggling bills or making sacrifices. This was about protecting something so valuable that people might hurt them to get it. That afternoon, Jennifer called back with a plan. She'd arranged for a team to arrive in 3 days, 2 art authentication experts, a representative from Christie's auction house, and a security consultant. In the meantime, She'd hired a local security company to patrol the property. 2 guards, rotating shifts, until everything could be properly assessed. "I know this is expensive," Jennifer said, "but consider it an investment in protecting your inheritance." "How much? For 3 days?" "About $4,000. Margaret felt sick. That was half of what they'd brought for the entire trip. But what choice did they have? "Okay," she said quietly. "Do it." Over the next 72 hours, Margaret and Harold existed in a strange limbo. They stayed at the motel, venturing out only for food and necessities. Margaret bought a prepaid phone at a drugstore so Harold could have his own phone in case they got separated. She felt paranoid doing it, but Jennifer had been firm. Prepare for anything. The security guards arrived that evening, 2 serious-looking men in their 30s who didn't ask questions, just set up a patrol schedule. Margaret gave them a key to the gate, but not to the house. The vault remained their secret for now. On the second night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to Harold snore softly, and thought about everything that had led them here. 54 years of marriage. 3 children raised in a $1,500 a month rental house. 41 years working in a factory that closed without warning. Medical bills that had crushed them. A system that had chewed them up and spit them out. And now this. A fortune. A secret. A responsibility. A fortune. A fortune. A fortune. A fortune. A fortune. She thought about Edmund Thorne, this mysterious relative she'd barely known. Why her? Why not sell the collection himself and live like a king? Why hide it away and pass it on to someone he'd met once? Decades ago, maybe he'd seen something in her. Or maybe he'd simply run out of time. The experts arrived on schedule. Margaret and Harold met them at the mansion Jennifer had driven up from Los Angeles herself, along with 2 men and 1 woman, all carrying professional equipment and wearing expressions of barely concealed excitement. "Mr. and Mrs. Walsh," Jennifer said warmly. "Thank you for your patience. This is Dr. Raymond Chen, art historian, specializing in 19th and 20th century work. This is Maria Gonzalez from Christie's Auction House. And this is Thomas Reed, former FBI, now working in private security and provenance verification." They all shook hands. Margaret felt small and out of place in her Walmart jeans and oversized cardigan. "Shall we?" Dr. Chen asked, his eyes already scanning the mansion's exterior with professional interest. Margaret led them inside. Through the foyer, up the stairs, down the hall to the library. She pushed the false wall, revealing the hidden passageway, the steel door, the keypad. She punched in the code. 1963. The door opened. The vault lights flickered on, and for 5 full seconds, no one said anything. Then Dr. Chen breathed. "Oh, my God." What followed was 6 hours of meticulous examination. The experts moved through the vault, like archaeologists uncovering a tomb. Each piece was photographed, measured, examined under special lights. Dr. Chen kept muttering to himself, occasionally calling Maria over to verify something. Margaret and Harold sat in the leather chair, sharing the space, watching it all happen. It felt surreal, like they were observing their own dream from the outside. At one point, Dr. Chen approached the Monet with a small handheld device. He scanned the surface carefully, then consulted his tablet. His hands were shaking. "This is real," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not a reproduction, not a study. This is an original Monet. The provenance checks out. It was last documented in a private collection in Paris in 1976. Then, it disappeared. Collectors have been looking for this painting for nearly 50 years. Maria was crouched in front of the Brad Pitt motorcycle, reading the documentation. This is extraordinary. Not just the bike itself, but the story behind it. Film collectors would pay millions just for the provenance. Thomas Reed, the security expert, had been quiet for most of the day, making notes and taking his own photographs. Finally, he approached Margaret. "Mrs. Walsh, I need to be straight with you. What you have here is beyond valuable. It's irreplaceable. And the moment this goes public, you're going to have every treasure hunter, journalist, and opportunist in the country trying to get close to it. To you." Margaret's stomach tightened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you need serious security. Professional security. And you need it. Yesterday." By the time the sun set, the experts had finished their preliminary assessment. They gathered in the library, laptops open, comparing notes. Finally, Dr. Chen cleared his throat. "Mr. and Mrs. Walsh, based on our examination today, and pending final authentication on a few pieces, we estimate the total value of this collection at approximately $247 million. The number hung in the air like smoke. $247 million. Margaret felt Harold's hand tighten around hers. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The number was too big to be real. "That's not including the property itself," Maria added gently, "which is worth another 12 to 15 million depending on market conditions." Jennifer stepped forward. "Here's what needs to happen next. We secure this vault properly. I'm talking biometric locks, cameras, the works. We get final authentication on the remaining pieces. We work with Brad Pitt's representatives to determine what, if anything, he wants returned. And then we figure out what you want to do with everything else." Margaret finally found her voice. "What do you mean? What we want to do?" "Well," Jennifer said carefully, "you have options. You could sell the entire collection at auction. You could donate pieces to museums for the tax write-off. You could keep it all and turn this into a private museum. Or some combination of all three. But that's a decision only you can make." That night, back at the motel, Margaret and Harold lay in the dark, neither of them sleeping. $247 million, Harold finally said. "I can't even picture that much money." "Me neither." A long silence. "Harold, yeah, I think I want to give most of it away." She felt him turn toward her in the darkness. "What?" "Not all of it. We'll keep enough. Enough to pay off the trailer, get you proper medical care, set something aside for the grandkids' college. But the rest." She paused, trying to find the words. "There are so many people like us out there. People who've worked their whole lives and still can't afford to survive. What if we could help them?" Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then she felt his hand find hers in the dark. "I think that's the best idea you've ever had." And lying there, in a $48 motel room, surrounded by the quiet sounds of the California night, Margaret Walsh began to dream of something bigger than treasure. She began to dream of purpose. The news broke on a Tuesday morning, exactly 8 days after they'd first opened the vault. Despite every precaution, despite the non-disclosure agreements, and the private appraisals, and the locked gates and security guards, someone talked. Maybe it was a janitor at Christie's who overheard something. Maybe it was an assistant who couldn't resist texting a friend. Or maybe the story was just too big, too impossible, too perfect to contain. The headline appeared first on TMZ at 6:47 in the morning. Elderly Ohio. Couple inherits. Brad Pitt's lost collection, hidden vault. Worth $250. Million found in abandoned Malibu mansion. By 7:30, it was everywhere. CNN ran a breaking news banner. Fox picked it up. The New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Entertainment Tonight, Access Hollywood. Within 2 hours, helicopter news crews were circling the mansion, their rotors thumping like artificial heartbeats. Paparazzi camped outside the motel where Margaret and Harold were staying. Cameras with lenses like telescopes pointed at their window. Margaret's phone rang constantly until she turned it off completely. Harold sat on the edge of the bed, remote in hand, flipping through news channels that all showed the same thing. Aerial shots of the mansion, old photos of Brad Pitt, speculation about how much the collection was worth, and the single photograph of Margaret and Harold that someone had dug up from somewhere, their 50th wedding anniversary picture from the church directory back in Ohio, both of them smiling awkwardly at the camera, looking old and poor, and utterly unprepared for this kind of attention. "How did they find that picture?" Margaret whispered, staring at her own face on the television screen. Harold shook his head. "I don't know. But Maggie, they're saying our names. Our full names. They know where we're from." A news anchor's voice filled the room. Margaret and Harold Walsh of Clearfield, Ohio, inherited the property from a distant relative and discovered what experts are calling one of the most significant private art collections in American history. The collection includes authenticated works by Monet, Rothko, and Picasso, as well as an extensive collection of memorabilia from actor Brad Pitt's personal estate. The total value is estimated at nearly $250 million. We reached out to representatives for Mr. Pitt, but have not yet received a comment. Margaret turned off the television. Her hands were shaking. "We need to leave. Right now." But when she pulled back the curtain and peeked outside, there were at least a dozen people in the parking lot. Photographers, reporters with microphones, a van with a satellite dish on top. They were trapped. Jennifer arrived within the hour, accompanied by 2 large men in dark suits who cleared a path through the crowd. Cameras flashed. Questions were shouted. "Mrs. Walsh, how does it feel to be rich?" "Mr. Walsh, are you going to return Brad Pitt's belongings? Did you know what was in the vault when you inherited it?" Margaret kept her head down, Harold clutching her arm as they were hustled into Jennifer's car. The tinted windows blocked out the cameras, but Margaret could still hear the shouting, could still feel the press of bodies around the vehicle. "I'm so sorry," Jennifer said as they pulled away. "I don't know how it leaked. We're investigating. But right now, we need to get you somewhere safe." She drove them to a private residence in the hills, a friend's vacation home that was currently empty. It was beautiful, all glass and modern architecture, but Margaret barely noticed. She felt like an animal in a cage, being moved from one enclosure to another. Once inside, Jennifer sat them down at a sleek kitchen table. "Okay, here's where we stand. The story is out. There's no putting it back in the bottle. We're going to be fielding media requests for weeks, maybe months. I've already had 3 law firms call claiming to represent distant relatives of Edmund Thorne, who want to contest the will." Harold's face went pale. "Can they do that?" "They can try. But the will is ironclad. Edmund was very clear about who he wanted to inherit the property and its contents. You're the legal heirs, but that doesn't mean people won't challenge it." Margaret felt sick. "What kind of people?" "All kinds. Cousins who haven't spoken to Edmund in 40 years. former business partners, claiming they have rights to parts of the collection. There's already one person claiming Edmund stole a painting in 1983 and they want it back. Jennifer sighed. Most of it is noise. Opportunists, but we'll have to respond to each claim legally, which takes time and money. How much money? Harold asked quietly. For legal fees? Potentially hundreds of thousands. Maybe more, depending on how aggressive people get. Margaret's head spun. They had a fortune, but they couldn't access it yet. And in the meantime, they were hemorrhaging money on lawyers and security and authentication experts. The irony was crushing. They were asset-rich and cash-poor, just like they'd always been. Only now the stakes were impossibly higher. There's more, Jennifer continued. I received a call this morning from Marcus Brennan. He's counsel for Brad Pitt's estate holdings. Margaret's stomach dropped. What did he say? He wants to meet with you. Today, if possible. 2 hours later, Margaret and Harold sat in the living room of the safe house, dressed in the nicest clothes they'd brought, which wasn't saying much. Margaret wore a cardigan that was only slightly pilled. Harold had put on the shirt he'd worn to their granddaughter's high school graduation 3 years ago. A black SUV pulled up. 3 men in expensive suits stepped out. Jennifer met them at the door and escorted them inside. The man in the lead was in his 40s, tall and polished, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. He introduced himself as Marcus Brennan, then introduced his colleagues, another attorney and a publicist. They settled into chairs across from Margaret and Harold. For a moment, everyone just looked at each other. Finally, Marcus spoke. Mr. and Mrs. Walsh, first let me say that Mr. Pitt sends his regards. He's been briefed on the situation and wants you to know he has no intention of making this difficult for you. Margaret felt her shoulders drop slightly. That's kind of him. The collection that Edmund Thorne acquired was purchased legally at a legitimate estate auction in 2003. What happened to it after that purchase is not Mr. Pitt's concern, legally speaking. However, Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. There are certain items in the collection that have significant sentimental value. Personal photographs, letters, a few pieces that were gifts from family members, things that were never meant to be sold at all, but somehow ended up in the auction by mistake. Harold leaned forward. We want to return those things. We never intended to keep anything that was meant to be private. Marcus looked genuinely surprised, then relieved. That's very gracious of you. Most people in your position would. He trailed off, but the implication was clear. Most people would try to keep everything. Sell it for maximum profit. Margaret shook her head. We're not most people. We know what it's like to lose things that matter. If there are items that belong with Mr. Pitt's family, we want them to have them back. The publicist leaned in. Mrs. Walsh, would you be willing to say that publicly? Because the media narrative right now is painting this as a treasure hunt story, and there's some concern about Mr. Pitt's privacy being violated. Of course, Margaret said. We never wanted this attention. We're just 2 old people who inherited something we don't fully understand yet. Marcus smiled for the first time. I believe that. And I think Mr. Pitt will appreciate your honesty. He asked me to tell you that if there's anything he can do to help, resources, connections, advice, you're welcome to reach out. They spent the next hour going through documentation, identifying which pieces were personal versus which were memorabilia. The photographs came back to the Pitt family. The letters, a watch that had belonged to Brad's grandfather, a few other items that had clear family significance. But the motorcycle stayed. The leather jacket from the Troy premiere, the guitar signed by Johnny Cash, the concept art from Fight Club. These were professional memorabilia, legitimately part of the auction, and therefore legitimately part of Margaret and Harold's inheritance. When Marcus and his team left, he shook both their hands warmly. "You're doing the right thing. Not many people would. The world needs more people like you." After they were gone, Margaret turned to Harold. "Did that really just happen?" "I think so. Though, I might be having a very elaborate dream." Jennifer smiled. "It happened. And honestly, that went as well as it possibly could have. Brad Pitt's team could have made your lives miserable with lawsuits and publicity. Instead, they're going to put out a statement supporting you. That's huge. Thanks for watching." End quote. But the challenges were just beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, the authentication process continued in earnest. More experts flew in from New York, London, Paris. Each piece was examined exhaustively. Provenance was verified through decades-old auction records, gallery receipts, insurance documents. Some pieces were confirmed as authentic. A few were revealed to be extremely good reproductions, still valuable, but not priceless. But the vast majority of the collection was real. The final authenticated inventory came back with a total value of $247 million. After taxes, legal fees, and settling the original tax liens with the investor who'd fronted the money, Margaret and Harold would walk away with approximately $92 million. $92 million. The number still didn't feel real, but the threats felt very real. The first letter arrived on a Wednesday, hand-delivered to Jennifer's office. No return address, just a single typed page. "You don't deserve this money. Edmund Thorne was a thief and a fraud. That collection includes pieces that were stolen from legitimate owners. If you try to sell them, you'll regret it. This is your only warning." Jennifer immediately contacted the FBI. An agent named Sarah Chen came to interview Margaret and Harold. She was in her 30s, sharp and professional, and she didn't sugarcoat anything. "These kinds of threats are common when large sums of money are involved," she explained. "Most of the time, it's just noise, someone trying to intimidate you into giving up or selling cheap. But we take every threat seriously. Have you noticed anyone following you? Any strange phone calls? Anything that made you uncomfortable?" Margaret thought about the photographer who'd somehow gotten into the building where they were staying and knocked on their door at 2 a.m. She thought about the man in the grocery store parking lot who'd approached Harold, asking for just a minute of his time to discuss a business opportunity. She thought about the feeling of being watched, constantly. "Even here in the safe house, everything makes us uncomfortable," she said quietly. "We're not used to this." Agent Chen nodded sympathetically. "I understand. We're going to increase patrols around the mansion, and I'd strongly suggest hiring private security for yourselves as well, at least until things calm down." That night, Harold had chest pains. Margaret found him sitting on the edge of the bed at 3 a.m, clutching his left arm, his face gray and slick with sweat. "Harold." She grabbed her phone, hands shaking so badly she could barely dial 911. The ambulance arrived in 12 minutes that felt like 12 hours. Paramedics loaded Harold onto a gurney. Margaret climbed into the ambulance with him, still in her nightgown and slippers, her mind blank with terror. At the emergency room, doctors ran tests: EKG, blood work, chest x-rays. Margaret sat in a plastic chair in the waiting room, praying to a God she wasn't sure she still believed in. Please, please don't take him. Not now. Not when we finally have a chance. 4 hours later, a doctor emerged. He was young, tired-looking. Mrs. Walsh? Margaret stood on shaking legs. Is he okay? He's stable. It wasn't a heart attack, but it was a severe episode of angina. His heart is under significant stress. When was the last time he saw a cardiologist? Margaret's throat tightened. 2 years ago. We couldn't afford to go back. The doctor's expression softened. I understand. But Mrs. Walsh, your husband needs surgery. His coronary arteries are severely blocked. Without intervention, he's at high risk for a major cardiac event. How much does it cost? With insurance, probably 10 to 15,000 out of pocket. Without insurance. He trailed off. Margaret almost laughed. They were worth $92 million on paper, but they still didn't have health insurance. Still couldn't afford the care Harold desperately needed. Because the money was tied up in authentication and legal proceedings and 1,000 other complications. We'll figure it out, she said. When can he have the surgery? I'd like to schedule it within the next 2 weeks. Margaret sat with Harold in his hospital room as the sun came up. He was sleeping, oxygen tubes in his nose, IV in his arm. He looked so small in the hospital bed, so fragile. This man who'd built houses with his bare hands, who'd carried her over the threshold of their first apartment, who'd never complained even when his body was breaking down. She held his hand and cried quietly. Jennifer arrived at 7 with coffee and practical advice. She'd already contacted the hospital billing department and arranged for Margaret and Harold to get on a health insurance plan immediately, backdated if possible. She'd also found a top cardiac surgeon who agreed to see Harold that afternoon. How are you paying for all this? Margaret asked. I don't have. Consider it an advance against your inheritance, Jennifer said gently. We'll work it out. Right now, you need to focus on getting Harold well. The surgery was scheduled for the following Monday. Harold would have a triple bypass. The surgeon was optimistic but honest about the risks. At his age, with his medical history, there are no guarantees. But without the surgery, his prognosis is poor. That weekend, while Harold rested and prepared for surgery, Margaret made a decision. She called Jennifer. I want to start giving money away. Now, before the full estate is settled. Margaret, that's not really how this works. The assets are still tied up in, I don't care. Figure out a way. Please. Jennifer was quiet for a moment. Then, what did you have in mind? There's a family back in Ohio, the Hendersons. Their trailer burned down last month, and they've been living in their car. I want to give them $20,000. Immediately. Margaret. And there's a woman I met at the food bank, Dolores, whose husband is a veteran and needs a wheelchair ramp built, but they can't afford it. $5,000. And the community center where I used to volunteer, they're about to close because they can't make rent. $15,000. Margaret. That's $40,000. I know. And I want to give more, as soon as possible, to as many people as possible. Because Harold is in that hospital bed right now, and we both know he might not make it through surgery. And if something happens to him, I need to know that this money did some good. That it meant something. Jennifer sighed, but Margaret could hear the smile in her voice. Okay, let me see what I can do. 3 days later, the first wire transfers went through. Margaret personally called each recipient. She heard the confusion, the disbelief, The tears. The Hendersons couldn't speak at first, just sobbed on the other end of the line. Dolores screamed with joy. The community center director said, "You're an angel, an actual angel." Margaret didn't feel like an angel. She felt like someone who'd been given an impossible gift and was trying desperately not to waste it. Harold's surgery lasted 6 hours. Margaret sat in the waiting room with Jennifer, not speaking, just existing in that terrible space of not knowing. She thought about all the times they'd almost lost each other. The cancer scare in '97 that turned out to be benign. The car accident in 2004 when a deer jumped in front of their Buick. And they'd spun into a ditch but walked away with only bruises. The morning 5 years ago when Harold had his first heart attack, and Margaret had performed CPR until the ambulance arrived. They'd survived so much. But luck ran out eventually. At hour 6, the surgeon emerged. He was smiling. He did great. Better than expected, actually. We were able to repair all 3 blockages. He's going to need significant recovery time, but I'm optimistic about his prognosis. Margaret's legs gave out. Jennifer caught her, held her while she sobbed with relief. 2 days later, Harold was moved out of ICU. He was weak, groggy from medication, but alive. Margaret sat beside his bed, holding his hand, and told him everything that had happened while he was in surgery. The money she'd given away, the people she'd helped. Harold smiled weakly. "That's my Maggie. Can't even wait for me to wake up before you start changing the world." "I was scared you wouldn't wake up," she admitted. "And I couldn't stand the thought of having all that money and not using it for something good. So what's next?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I want to start a foundation, the Thorn Foundation, for people like us, elderly Americans who've worked their whole lives and still can't make ends meet. People who have to choose between medicine and food. People who are one emergency away from losing everything." Harold squeezed her hand. "That's perfect. You're okay with that? Giving away most of it?" He looked at her with eyes that had seen 5 decades of life together. "Maggie, we spent 50 years with nothing, and we were happy. Now we have more than we could ever spend, and it feels like a responsibility more than a gift. If we can help people, really help them, then maybe this whole crazy thing happened for a reason." Over the next 6 weeks, while Harold recovered, Margaret threw herself into building the foundation. Jennifer connected her with non-profit attorneys, accountants, grant specialists. They set up a board of directors. Jennifer, a retired social worker, a non-profit consultant, and Margaret herself as president. The mission was simple: to provide direct financial assistance to elderly Americans living in poverty. No bureaucracy, no waiting lists, just help when people needed it most. They established criteria. Applicants had to be 65 or older, living at or below poverty line, and facing a specific crisis, medical emergency, housing insecurity, utility shutoff, something immediate and desperate. The first grants went out within 8 weeks. Margaret reviewed every application personally. She cried over most of them, because she saw herself in every story: the exhaustion, the fear, the quiet desperation of people who'd worked their whole lives and still couldn't make ends meet. A woman in Kentucky whose cancer treatment had bankrupted her. A veteran in Texas whose trailer had been destroyed in a tornado. $22,000 for a new, manufactured home. A couple in their own hometown of Clearfield, Ohio, who were facing eviction. $8,000 to catch up on rent and avoid homelessness. Each time Margaret made a call to tell someone they'd been approved, She heard the same thing: disbelief, gratitude, tears. Often the person on the other end couldn't speak at first. The emotional weight of being seen, being helped, being told that someone cared, was overwhelming. One woman in Arizona wrote a letter that Margaret would keep forever. "Dear Mrs. Walsh, I was 3 days away from losing my home. I didn't know where I was going to go. I'm 78 years old, and I thought this was how my story would end. Homeless, forgotten, alone. Your foundation saved my life. But more than that, you made me feel seen, like I mattered, like I wasn't invisible. Thank you for remembering that people like me exist." Margaret read that letter out loud to Harold one evening as they sat on the patio of the small house they'd rented in California. They'd decided to stay for a while, to be near the mansion and oversee the foundation's work. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. "We did the right thing," she said quietly. Harold squeezed her hand. "We did." But the journey wasn't without continued challenges. 2 months after the foundation launched, they were hit with their first major lawsuit. A man claiming to be Edmund Thorne's business partner in the 1980s filed a complaint alleging that several pieces in the collection had been purchased with money he'd loaned Edmund, and therefore he was entitled to compensation. The case was frivolous. He had no documentation, no proof, no credible claim. But it still required a response. Legal fees, court appearances, stress. Then came the relatives. Second cousins, third cousins, people Margaret had never heard of, all claiming that Edmund's will should be invalidated for various reasons. He wasn't of sound mind. He was under undue influence. The will was forged. None of it was true, but each claim had to be investigated and refuted. And then there were the scammers, people pretending to be charities, asking for donations, investment advisors, offering to manage their money for a hefty fee. Of course, even a fake FBI agent who showed up at their house claiming there was an investigation into the collection's provenance, and they needed to hand over certain pieces immediately. Margaret had called the real FBI, who'd arrested the man on the spot. Through it all, Margaret felt herself changing, growing, not just older, but stronger. She learned to say no, learned to spot manipulation, learned to trust her instincts and protect what mattered. She was no longer the scared woman sitting in the county assistant's office, clutching a folder of unpaid bills. She was becoming something else, someone who'd been given an impossible responsibility and was rising to meet it. The mansion in Malibu was officially deeded to the foundation. The vault was converted into a private museum, open by appointment only, with all proceeds going to help elderly Americans in poverty. The upper floors were restored and turned into a retreat center where artists and writers could stay for free, creating in the same space where Edmund Thorne had once hidden his treasures. Margaret and Harold moved back to Ohio, not to the trailer that had already been sold, but to a small, comfortable house with a garden and a porch swing. Nothing extravagant, just enough. They paid off their medical bills, set up college funds for their grandchildren, gave substantial gifts to their 3 children, enough that no one would ever struggle the way they had. And then they started traveling. Not to fancy resorts or exotic locations. They traveled to meet the people the foundation was helping. They sat in living rooms and hospital rooms and community centers, listening to stories, holding hands, being present. "This is what the money is for," Margaret would say. "Not yachts, not mansions. This. It's sometimes of pass. Margaret, weekade cheesy. One afternoon, 6 months after the vault was discovered, Margaret stood in front of a crowd of 200 people at a community center in Detroit. She'd been invited to speak about the foundation, about what they were trying to accomplish. She wore a simple dress, no jewelry except her wedding ring. Her hand still showed the calluses and age spots of 73 years of living. But when she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. "My husband and I spent most of our lives struggling," she began. "We worked hard. We did everything right. And still, we couldn't make ends meet. We felt invisible, forgotten, like we didn't matter." She paused, looking out at the faces elderly people, tired people, people who understood exactly what she was talking about. Then something impossible happened. We inherited a fortune, and it would have been easy to keep it all, to buy a big house and fancy cars, and live like we'd always dreamed. But that felt wrong, because we remembered what it was like to be forgotten, and we knew there were millions of people out there, just like us, still struggling, still invisible. So we decided to do something different. We decided that this money wasn't just ours. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been overlooked or dismissed or told they didn't matter. And we're going to spend the rest of our lives proving that you do matter, that we all matter. The applause was thunderous. People stood. Some were crying. Afterward, a young woman approached Margaret. She looked to be in her 30s, eyes red and swollen. "Mrs. Walsh, I just wanted to thank you. My grandmother died last year because she couldn't afford her heart medication. She was 82, and she chose to skip her pills so she could pay rent. And she died." The woman's voice broke. "Your foundation helped my grandfather after she passed, paid for her funeral, helped him get back on his feet. He's still here because of you." Margaret pulled her into a tight hug. "Your grandmother deserved better. They all do. That's why we're doing this." When she pulled back, she looked the young woman in the eyes. "What was her name?" "Eleanor. Eleanor Martinez." Margaret pulled out her phone and typed the name into her notes. "I'm going to remember her. And I promise you, we're not going to stop. We're going to keep fighting until no one has to make that choice ever again." That night, back in their little house in Ohio, Margaret sat on the porch swing with Harold. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink. Crickets sang in the garden. It was peaceful, simple, perfect. "Do you ever regret it?" Harold asked. "Giving so much away. Giving so much away." Margaret thought about it. Really thought about it. She thought about the mansion they could have kept, the cars they could have bought, the luxury they could have afforded. Then she thought about Eleanor Martinez, about the Hendersons in their new trailer, about Dolores's husband wheeling himself up his new ramp, about the 73 families they'd helped so far, and the hundreds more waiting. "No," she said firmly, "because what we gave away, we never really owned. It was always meant to be shared. And the joy we've gotten from helping people is worth more than any mansion or yacht or fancy car. We go to bed every night knowing we made a difference. And that's a kind of richness money can't buy." Harold nodded, tears in his eyes. "I love you, Maggie. I love you too." They sat together as darkness fell. Two old people who'd been given an impossible gift and chosen to turn it into something beautiful. The fortune hadn't changed who they were. It had revealed it. And in doing so, they discovered that the greatest wealth wasn't hidden in a vault beneath a mansion. It was found in the lives they touched, the hope they restored, and the simple truth that kindness, real, deliberate, Costly kindness was the most powerful force in the world. 3 years after finding the vault, Margaret Walsh stood in front of the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., wearing a navy blue dress her daughter had helped her pick out. The fabric was soft, expensive, in a way that still made Margaret uncomfortable. But Jennifer had insisted. "You're receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom," she'd said. "You can't wear your Walmart cardigan." So here she was, at 76 years old, hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the front of her dress. Harold stood beside her in his first ever tailored suit, oxygen tubes discreetly tucked beneath his collar. He was 79 now, moving slower, but his eyes sparkled with the same warmth they'd held when he was 22 and asking her to dance at a church social. Behind them, in the reception area, their 3 children gathered with spouses and grandchildren. Sarah, their oldest, kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Michael, their middle child, had flown in from Seattle with his entire family. And Jessica, their baby who was now 51, stood with her arm around her teenage son, both of them beaming with pride. "Mom," Jessica had whispered earlier, "do you realize you're about to meet the president?" Margaret had laughed nervously. "I'm trying not to think about it, or I might throw up." But now, standing in the wings of the Kennedy Center Concert Hall, watching the ceremony begin, Margaret felt something settle inside her. Not calm exactly, but purpose. She knew why she was here, and it wasn't because she'd found a fortune. It was because of what she'd done with it. The citation was read aloud by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, her voice echoing through the hall. "For extraordinary dedication to the welfare of America's elderly population, and for demonstrating that true wealth is measured not in what we keep, but in what we give. For creating the Thorn Foundation and personally ensuring that over 23,000 American seniors received critical financial assistance in their time of greatest need. For proving that compassion, when paired with resources and will, can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. 23,000 families." Margaret let that number sink in as she walked onto the stage, Harold beside her moving carefully with his walker. The audience rose in applause. Cameras flashed. But Margaret's eyes found her grandchildren in the 3rd row, all 7 of them. And that's what made her smile. The president placed the medal around her neck. Heavy, significant, surreal, and shook her hand warmly. "Mrs. Walsh, your story reminds us what's possible when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things. Thank you for your service to this nation." Margaret could only nod, her throat too tight for words. When it came time for her acceptance speech, she'd prepared remarks. Jennifer had helped her write them. But standing at the podium, looking out at 500 faces, Margaret set her notes aside. "I'm not very good at fancy speeches," she began, her voice carrying that slight Ohio twang she'd never lost. "So I'm just going to tell you the truth." She gripped the podium. 3 years ago, my husband and I were about to lose everything. We'd worked our whole lives, raised 3 beautiful children, paid our taxes, did everything we were supposed to do, and still, we couldn't afford Harold's heart medication. We couldn't pay our electric bill. We were 6 weeks away from being homeless. The room was silent. Then we inherited a mansion we didn't know existed, from a relative we barely remembered. And inside that mansion, we found a fortune. More money than we'd ever imagined. Enough to solve every problem we'd ever had. She paused, looking at Harold, who nodded encouragingly. "And you know what the hardest part was? Not the media circus, not the lawsuits, not the threats. The hardest part was realizing that we could finally afford to help ourselves. But there were millions of people out there just like us who were still struggling, still choosing between medicine and food, still losing their homes because one medical emergency bankrupted them. Margaret's voice grew stronger. We didn't ask for this responsibility, but we were given it. And we decided that the only way to honor that gift was to share it, to remember where we came from, to look at that fortune and see not what it could buy us, but what it could do for others. She looked around the room. I've met so many people over these past 3 years. Grandmothers who worked 3 jobs and still ended up homeless. Veterans who served their country and came home to poverty. People who spent their entire lives contributing to society. And society forgot about them. Her voice cracked slightly. Every time we help someone, every time we give a grant or pay a medical bill or save someone's home, I think about the county assistant's office where Harold and I sat 3 years ago. I think about the young caseworker who was so kind but so powerless. I think about how it felt to be invisible, and I think, not anymore. Not if we can help it. The applause when she finished was thunderous. People rose to their feet. Margaret saw her daughter Sarah openly crying, saw Harold wiping his eyes, saw strangers in the audience dabbing at their faces. But what moved her most was afterwards. In the reception, when a woman in her 80s approached. She was dressed simply, her hands gnarled with arthritis, and she carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd worked hard for everything she had. Mrs. Walsh, the woman said quietly, I applied to your foundation 6 months ago. My husband needed dialysis, and we couldn't afford the co-pays. You approved us for $12,000. She took Margaret's hand. He's still alive because of you. We celebrated our 60th anniversary last month. I got 60 more years with the man I love, because you remembered that people like us exist. Margaret pulled her into a hug. This stranger who felt like family. What's your name? Ruth. Ruth Patterson. Ruth. Thank you for letting us help. That's the gift. You know. You let us be part of your story. When the woman walked away, Harold appeared at Margaret's elbow. You okay? Yeah, Margaret said, smiling through tears. Better than okay. The flight back to Ohio the next day was quiet. Margaret stared out the window at the patchwork of fields and towns below, the medal in its case on her lap. She thought about how far they'd come. Not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally. 3 years ago, she'd been a woman who felt small, powerless, invisible. Now she was someone who moved through the world with purpose. Not because she had money, though that helped, but because she'd learned that her voice mattered, that her choices had weight. That one person really could make a difference. Their little house in Clearfield came into view as they drove from the airport. It was modest, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a front porch with the swing Harold had built. The garden Margaret had planted was in full bloom. Roses and lavender and tomato plants, heavy with fruit. It was home. Inside, the walls were covered with photographs. Not just of their family, though those were there too, but photos of the people they'd helped. Families standing in front of homes they'd been able to keep. Elderly couples at anniversary parties they'd been able to afford. Veterans with new wheelchair ramps, new heating systems, new hope. Each photo had a story, and Margaret knew every single one. The foundation had grown beyond anything they'd imagined. What had started as Margaret personally reviewing applications at her kitchen table had evolved into a full organization with a staff of 17, offices in 3 cities, and a rigorous but compassionate application process. They'd helped 23,000 families so far, distributed over $152 million in direct aid, built 2 affordable housing communities specifically for elderly residents, funded 3 free medical clinics, partnered with Medicare advocacy groups to change laws around prescription drug pricing, and they'd done it all while living modestly in their little house, driving a sensible Toyota Camry that Harold had picked out because it has good safety ratings, and eating dinner at 4:30 every evening like they always had. The money hadn't changed who they were. It had amplified it, but the impact went beyond numbers and dollar amounts. It rippled outward in ways Margaret was still discovering. Their hometown of Clearfield had transformed. When word first broke about the inheritance, there'd been skepticism, gossip. Some people thought Margaret and Harold would forget where they came from, would move away and never look back. Instead, they'd come home, and they'd brought resources with them. The community center where Margaret used to volunteer. The foundation had not only saved it from closing, but funded a complete renovation. Now it offered free programs for seniors, exercise classes, art workshops, computer training, a daily lunch program. The waiting list to get in had disappeared. Instead, there were more programs than they could fill. The trailer park where they'd lived for 30 years. Margaret had quietly purchased it through the foundation, then sold each lot to the residents for $1. People who'd been paying rent their whole lives suddenly owned their homes. The look on Gloria's face, their former neighbor, who'd collected their mail when they drove to California when she received her deed, was something Margaret would never forget. "I own it," Gloria had whispered, staring at the paper like it might vanish. "I really own it." "You really own it," Margaret had confirmed. The local food bank received a grant that tripled its capacity. The free clinic got new equipment. The senior center got a new roof and a van for transportation. None of it had Margaret and Harold's names on it. They didn't want recognition. They just wanted their hometown to thrive. One Saturday morning, 6 months after returning from Washington, Margaret was at the farmer's market, buying tomatoes, when she noticed something different. People were smiling more. The vendors seemed more relaxed. There was a lightness in the air that hadn't been there before. The tomato vendor, a man named Pitt who'd been farming for 40 years, packed up her purchase and refused her money. "This one's on me, Mrs. Walsh." "Pitt, I can pay. I know you can. But you helped my mother last year when she had that stroke. Paid for her rehab when insurance wouldn't cover it. She's back in her house now, doing great. So please, let me give you some tomatoes." Margaret took them with tears in her eyes. "How is your mom?" "Feisty as ever. She wants you to come by sometime. Says she makes a better apple pie than you." Margaret laughed. "Tell her I accept that challenge." This kept happening. Everywhere she went, people wanted to thank her, to tell her their stories, to explain how the foundation had helped their grandmother or their father or their friend. The connections multiplied like roots spreading underground, invisible but vital. The town council named a park after Edmund Thorne. Margaret had insisted on honoring the man who'd made it all possible. The dedication ceremony drew 200 people. Margaret spoke about Edmund, this mysterious relative who'd saved his fortune not for himself, but for whoever came after, who'd believed that wealth meant nothing if it wasn't shared. He could have lived like a king, Margaret said, but he chose to live quietly, to preserve these treasures, to pass them on. And I think he knew, somehow, that they'd end up doing good. that they'd end up helping people. She paused. So thank you, Edmund, for trusting us, for remembering us, for proving that family isn't just blood, it's who chooses to lift you up. The Malibu mansion had become something special too. The museum portion of the vault drew visitors from around the world, art lovers, film historians, people who wanted to see the collection that had been hidden for so long. But it was the retreat center upstairs that Margaret was most proud of. Artists, writers, musicians, people whose talents deserved space to grow could apply for residencies. They stayed for free, created in rooms that overlooked the Pacific, and in exchange, they contributed one piece to the Foundation's collection: paintings, sculptures, poems, music. The walls that had once held Edmund's secrets now held new stories, new voices, new beauty. And Brad Pitt had kept his word about supporting them. Not only had he donated $2 million to the foundation when his memoir came out, but he'd become an unofficial ambassador. When asked about the collection in interviews, he spoke thoughtfully about legacy, about what we owe each other, about how Margaret and Harold had shown him a different way to think about fortune. One evening, Margaret's phone rang with a California number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She'd learned to be cautious, but something made her pick up. Mrs. Walsh. This is Brad Pitt. Margaret almost dropped the phone. Mr. Pitt. Hello. His laugh was warm. I'm sorry to call out of the blue. I just wanted to tell you that I saw your speech at the Kennedy Center. Someone sent me a video, and I wanted you to know it moved me deeply. Oh, thank you. I also wanted you to know that I'm setting up my own foundation, focused on affordable housing for the elderly. And you inspired it. The work you're doing, the way you're doing it, it reminded me that those of us with resources have a responsibility to use them well. Margaret sat down, overwhelmed. Mr. Pitt, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know that your ripple effect is bigger than you realize. You're changing how people think about wealth and responsibility, and the world needs that. After they hung up, Margaret sat in her kitchen, staring at her phone. Harold appeared in the doorway. Who was that? Brad Pitt. Harold blinked. The actor. Yeah. What did he want? To say thank you. And that we inspired him. They looked at each other for a long moment. Then Harold started laughing. Deep, genuine belly laughs that shook his shoulders. Margaret joined in. And soon, they were both cackling like teenagers, tears streaming down their faces. We inspired Brad Pitt. Harold gasped between laughs. I know, Margaret wheezed. It was absurd, impossible, wonderful. But the moments Margaret treasured most weren't the big ones. They were the quiet ones. Like the Sunday afternoon she spent teaching her granddaughter Emma how to make pie crust, flour dusting both their hands, the kitchen warm and sweet-smelling. Grandma, Emma asked as they rolled out the dough. Is it true you used to worry about having enough money for food? Margaret paused. Emma was 16 now, smart and curious, and growing into someone remarkable. Yes, honey, it's true, but you were working. Both you and Grandpa. We were. Sometimes, that's not enough. Emma frowned, processing. That's not fair. No. It's not. Is that why you give so much money away now? Because you remember? Too. Margaret looked at her granddaughter. This beautiful soul, who was learning that the world wasn't always fair, but that you could choose to make it better. Exactly. because I remember what it felt like to be forgotten, and I never want anyone else to feel that way." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Then, I want to work for the foundation someday. When I'm older, I want to help too." Margaret's heart swelled. "I think that's a wonderful idea." Or the evening Harold's doctor declared him healthy enough to travel, and they took their first real vacation not to somewhere exotic, but to visit their daughter Sarah in Oregon, whom they hadn't seen in person in 4 years. Sarah met them at the airport, and when she saw her parents, her mother standing taller, her father moving slowly but steadily, she broke down crying. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered into Margaret's shoulder. "When you told me about the foreclosure notice, about Dad's heart, I thought I was going to lose you, and I couldn't do anything to help." "We're okay now," Margaret soothed. "We're more than okay." They spent a week with Sarah and her family, doing ordinary things that felt extraordinary because they'd almost lost the chance. Board games, walks in the park, dinner around the table with 3 generations talking and laughing, and simply being together. On their last night, Sarah's husband pulled Margaret aside. "I need to tell you something. When Sarah heard about your inheritance, she was scared. She thought the money would change you, that you'd become different people." He smiled. "But you didn't. You became more yourselves, more of the generous, compassionate people you always were. And that's given our kids something priceless, proof that good people exist. That when given the chance, some people really do choose to help others." Margaret hugged him tight. "Thank you for taking care of my daughter. Thank you for showing us what integrity looks like." Back home in Ohio, life settled into a new rhythm. Margaret worked for the foundation 3 days a week, reviewing applications, meeting with staff, planning new initiatives. Harold volunteered at the community center, teaching basic home repair to younger folks who wanted to learn. They had dinner with friends. They babysat grandchildren. They lived, but they also grieved. Edmund Thorne's grave was in a small cemetery in Los Angeles, largely unmarked and unvisited. When Margaret learned this, it broke her heart. This man who'd given them everything, who'd saved not just their lives but thousands of others, deserved to be remembered. She and Harold flew to California and arranged for a proper headstone. Simple but beautiful, with an inscription Margaret wrote herself. Edmund Thorne, 1963 to 2023. He saved beauty so others could save lives. His legacy lives in every person helped, every home saved, every hope restored. They visited the grave together. Margaret placing flowers, roses, because Edmund had grown them around the mansion. "Thank you," she said aloud, not caring if anyone heard. "Thank you for seeing something in me, for trusting me with this. I hope we've made you proud." Harold added quietly, "We'll keep going, for as long as we can. Your gift is still giving." 5 years after finding the vault, the foundation celebrated a milestone. They'd helped their 50,000th family. The staff wanted to throw a big gala, invite donors and press, and make it a spectacle. Margaret said absolutely not. Instead, they held a simple gathering at the Clearfield Community Center. They invited the first 100 families the foundation had ever helped. People flew in from Kentucky and Texas and Arizona and Washington. The room filled with laughter and tears, and the kind of gratitude that goes bone deep. Margaret stood in the center of the room and looked around at the faces, grandmothers and grandfathers, veterans and widows, people who'd been on the brink and found solid ground again. "This," she said to Harold, who stood beside her with his walker, "this is what it was all for." An elderly veteran approached, wearing his service medals. Margaret recognized him. Robert Chen, one of their earliest recipients. The foundation had paid for emergency roof repairs after a storm damaged his house. "Mrs. Walsh, I brought you something." He handed her a folded flag, the kind given to families at military funerals. "This was my wife's. She passed last month, peacefully. In the house we were able to keep because of you. I wanted you to have it. As a thank you." Margaret tried to refuse, it was too precious, but Robert insisted. "She would have wanted you to have it. You gave us dignity when the world had taken it away. That's worth more than money. She would have wanted you to calm. One static state." That night, Margaret placed the flag in a shadow box and hung it in the foundation's main office, beside photos of the people they'd helped. It became a reminder of why they did this work. Not for recognition or praise, but because dignity mattered. Because every person deserved to grow old without fear. Because society's worth was measured by how it treated its most vulnerable. As Margaret approached 80, she began thinking about succession. She and Harold wouldn't live forever. The foundation needed to outlast them. They brought in their granddaughter Emma, now 21 and fresh out of college, with a degree in non-profit management. She'd meant it when she said she wanted to help. She joined the board, learning the work, understanding the mission. "It's not about the money," Margaret told her during one of their weekly meetings. "It's about remembering that every application represents a real person with a real life. Someone's grandmother, someone's father, someone who matters." Emma nodded seriously. "I understand, Grandma. And when Harold and I are gone, this has to continue. Promise me." "I promise." Margaret also worked with Jennifer to establish an endowment. A significant portion of the original fortune was set aside in trust, invested wisely, designed to fund the foundation in perpetuity. Even after Margaret and Harold were gone, the work would continue. The legacy would live. On their 60th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party at the Clearfield Community Center, the same place where they'd first met at a church social in 1971. The room was packed. Family, friends, people from the foundation, neighbors, strangers who'd become family through shared purpose. The mayor gave a speech. Jessica's husband made a toast. And then Harold, who rarely spoke in public, asked for the microphone. 60 years, he began, his voice rough but strong. 60 years with this woman. We've been broke more times than I can count. We've faced things that should have broken us. But we survived because we had each other. He looked at Margaret, his eyes wet. 3 years ago, we were about to lose everything. And then something impossible happened. We were given a second chance, a fortune, a responsibility. And Maggie, she didn't hesitate. She looked at all that money and said, "Let's give it away. Because that's who she is. That's who she's always been. 10 Penensa. Just a time." His voice cracked. "I'm the luckiest man alive. Not because we have money, but because I got to spend 60 years with someone who taught me that the best way to live is to give. That we're only as rich as the people we help." He turned to the crowd. "Thank you all for being part of our story, for letting us be part of yours, for believing that the world can be better." The applause was deafening. Afterward, as the party wound down, Margaret and Harold slipped outside. The sun was setting, painting the Ohio sky in shades of orange and pink. They sat on a bench in Edmund Thorne Memorial Park, watching children play on the new playground equipment the foundation had funded. "We did good, didn't we?" Harold asked. Margaret took his hand, the same hand that had held hers through 54 years of marriage before the inheritance, and 6 years after. "We did better than good. We did what mattered. Do you ever miss it? The simple life? Before all this?" Margaret considered the question. She thought about their trailer with the dripping faucet and thin walls, about the fear that had lived in her chest for years, constant and suffocating, about feeling invisible. "No," she said. "I don't miss the fear. I don't miss the struggle. But I'm grateful for it, because it taught me what matters. It taught me to see people who are suffering, to remember what it feels like." She squeezed his hand. "We were given a gift, Harold. Not just money, but purpose, the chance to matter, to make a difference. How many people get that?" They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon. Around them, the town they'd saved hummed with life. Lights flickered on in houses. Families gathered for dinner. The world kept turning. And two elderly people who'd once been forgotten sat together, knowing they'd left it better than they'd found it. Anyone can find treasure if they're willing to look. But the real miracle isn't what you discover. It's what you choose to do with it. As the evening stars appeared over Clearfield, Ohio, Margaret Walsh didn't count her fortune or admire her medal. She thought about Eleanor Martinez, the grandmother who died choosing between medicine and rent. She thought about Ruth Patterson, who'd gotten 60 years with her husband because someone cared. She thought about the 50,000 families and counting whose lives had been changed by one impossible inheritance, and two people who refused to forget where they came from. The woman who once sat in a county assistant's office, terrified and desperate, had become a force for good that rippled across the nation. Not because she was special or chosen, but because when life handed her an unexpected gift, she chose to multiply it through giving. Because for Margaret, Harold, and everyone whose lives they touched, the greatest fortune isn't hidden in a vault or measured in dollars. It's written in the lives we save, the dignity we restore, and the legacy we build when we dare to believe that one person, one choice, one act of radical generosity can change everything. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the truth deserves a voice, and that kindness can change the world.